Medicaid is one of the largest social spending programs in America, and one of the more misunderstood programs as well. It's used by about 100 million people. So why are Republicans trying to slash it? Congressman Ritchie Torres joins the podcast to discuss the House Republican budget resolution and the $1 trillion that they want to cut from Medicaid. What does Medicaid fund? Why is it a vital part of our social safety net? Who would be hurt by these cuts? And what can we do to raise awareness of the Republicans' efforts to slash one of the most important safety nets in America? As always, thank you for listening. If you want to support the podcast and the Center for New Liberalism, please become a member. Members get involved with their local communities, their local chapters, they make a difference in local politics, and they get access to fun stuff like free stickers, our Slack, bonus episodes of the podcast, and more. You can become a member today by going to cnliberalism.org/become a member. Thanks for listening one more time, and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me today is Congressman Ritchie Torres. Congressman, welcome to the show.
A pleasure to be here.
So today we're talking about everyone's favorite thing to do, the federal budget, and specifically we're talking about Medicaid, which is one of the largest social spending programs in the country, but I find that people tend to know less about it than they know about Social Security or Medicare. Social Security is obviously pretty easy to understand for the most part. For the most part, you just get a check. But Medicaid is a trickier program. Can you give people a quick introduction into what Medicaid is and what it does for those who might not be familiar?
The best definition of the federal government came from Ezra Klein, who once said that the federal government is an insurance firm with an army. And so Medicaid is one of the core functions of the federal government, even though it's seen as less politically sacrosanct as Medicare. Medicaid is no less important. Medicaid is the largest payer of health care and long-term care in the nation. It is the health insurance program for the lowest income. And it's the long-term care program for the elderly and the chronically ill and the disabled. And even though we think of Medicare as a program for the elderly, Medicaid is just as important to the elderly. The elderly and the disabled benefit disproportionately from Medicaid. In New York, the elderly and the disabled make up 20% of Medicaid enrollments, but account for 60% of Medicaid expenditures. So it is as critical a program for the elderly as Medicare.
There's been recent fighting in Congress about the state of Medicaid, and Republicans have passed, or they haven't passed, I should say. They've proposed a budget that Democrats say would include a large amount of cuts to Medicaid, and Republicans are denying this. They're saying, we haven't put any cuts to Medicaid in there. And so there's kind of been bickering back and forth about whether or not this is really happening, but it's got everybody talking about the cuts to Medicaid. What is actually happening, and what is the Republican-controlled Congress attempting to do with their proposed budget resolution that may come up, that may get a vote later this year?
So House Republicans passed a budget resolution, which is not the actual budget, it's budget instructions. And the budget resolution instructs the Energy and Commerce Committee, which has jurisdiction over healthcare, to identify $880 billion worth of cuts. The Congressional Budget Office has said that it is mathematically impossible for Energy and Commerce to cut up to $880 billion without affecting Medicaid. And so for all intents and purposes, the Republicans have proposed a budget that would cut Medicaid by up to $880 billion, which would be a catastrophe for most of the country. There are countless counties in America where the largest employer is often the healthcare provider. And there's not a single healthcare provider in the country that does not depend heavily on Medicaid.
So essentially, they're kind of saying, like, I didn't say you had to cut off your leg. I just said you had to lose 25 pounds in the next 3 minutes. You figure it out.
It is simply impossible to cut, for Energy and Commerce to make $880 billion worth of cuts without draconian cuts to Medicaid. And so to claim otherwise is utterly disingenuous, and the Republicans are being disingenuous.
And what would this mean in practice? Because I think, again, people are pretty familiar with like Social Security. It's easy to understand. If somebody cuts Social Security, the number on the check goes down. Maybe you used to get a $700 check and now you're getting like a $420 check. And I think people pretty easily get that. But I know that your district, for instance, has some of the most Medicaid enrollees in the country. Obviously, it's one of the poorer districts in Congress. What would this actually mean for people in your district if Medicaid was to be cut? What like practical impacts would that have?
So I represent the lowest income congressional district in America, which has 67% Medicaid enrollment. 67% of my constituents are enrolled in Medicaid. And if these cuts were to go forward, it would lead to the collapse of safety net hospitals in the Bronx and elsewhere in America. Hospitals like St. Barnabas or Jacobi or Lincoln or Bronx Care simply could not function without access to sufficient Medicaid funding. And keep in mind that Medicaid as is, under reimburses healthcare providers. It reimburses below the actual cost of care. In New York, Medicaid reimburses 60 cents on the dollar. And so most of the hospitals in places like the Bronx are presently teetering on the brink. There was a New York hospital fiscal survey which found that 75% of the hospitals in New York have insufficient operating margins. 50% are in the red and 25% are in the brink. And $880 billion worth of cuts to Medicaid would simply compound the fiscal crisis confronting the hospital system in America, especially in the lowest income communities. It would mean the loss of healthcare for the lowest income, the loss of healthcare for the elderly, the disabled, and the chronically ill. It would mean less long-term care at a time when we have an aging population. More and more Americans are living longer and longer, and their healthcare needs are becoming more complex. And the need for long-term care, the need for Medicare is growing over time.
It certainly seems like you can't cut something like that without affecting care. If they're reimbursing 60 cents on the dollar right now, if hospitals are, as you say, teetering on the brink, and that gets reduced further, if that, they suddenly are now only reimbursing hospitals at the rate of 55 cents on the dollar or 50 or 45 cents on the dollar, then it's hard to see how you live in that world without hospital closures or just reduced service. Just the quality of care goes down or the volume of care goes down. And I think you'd have to see some really tough decisions about, do we just cut programs? Do we just, patients are just going to have to wait in much crappier hospitals now? Speaking frankly, I think you face a real Sophie's choice there.
And keep in mind that it would not only mean the loss of healthcare, but also the loss of employment and economic growth. It is often the case that the largest employer in urban and rural counties is the healthcare provider. I know from my district, the hospital system generates over $15 billion in economic activity, more than $5.5 billion in payroll expenditures, $3.5 billion in tax revenue. And much of that would be lost in a world where the Republicans were able to cut Medicaid in the tune of $880 billion. The largest employer by district is the Montefiore Health System, which employs tens of thousands of people. there would be mass unemployment if those cuts were to move forward.
And we should say, this is not really a partisan issue in terms of who it affects. Certainly, it's a very partisan issue in terms of what the two parties are trying to do in Congress. But, there are districts like Representative Torres's that are very Democratic, that rely a lot on Medicaid. But there are also very Republican districts that rely a lot on Medicaid. And frankly, if you look at a map, Medicaid on a state by state level, enrollment tends to be higher a little bit in red states as opposed to, your New York, California, Illinois. So this, the people who are affected are people from everywhere, urban, rural, white, black, Latino, everyone could be potentially impacted by this.
Medicaid is a universal program. I mean, it affects the young, the elderly. I know in my district, Medicaid covers more than 50% of emergency visits and clinic visits and outpatient surgeries. It covers more than 70% of children, more than 80% of nursing home residents, more than 90% of baby deliveries. And so the centrality of Medicaid to American healthcare is hard to overstate.
It just makes me tired, man. I don't know, I feel so grim talking about this, and I don't know. I'm in the middle of it in the sense that I talk about politics all the time, and my day job is hosting this podcast and writing about this stuff. But you're really in the middle of it, and do you ever just get tired of this nonsense? I'm trying not to swear too much, but it just seems like every couple of years, we have a different culture war fight, and Republicans, they leverage some culture war nonsense to get into power. But once they're here, it's always the same thing. It's always, we want to cut Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and we want to provide tax cuts for the rich. Because that's the context for this is that they want to provide about $5 trillion worth of tax cuts that would go almost all to very wealthy people. And, gutting Medicaid is one of the ways they want to pay for it. And it's just, this is almost an unprofessional line of questioning, but do you ever just get tired of it? It's just crazy.
It feels to me government at every level is broken. Our politics is broken. And, certainly the frontal assaults on Medicaid is causing me sleepless nights because my district would be hit the hardest. And, it feels like we live in a morally inverted universe. In the age of Donald Trump. The Donald Trump and congressional Republicans are proposing to cut nutritional assistance by up to $230 billion, education by up to $330 billion, healthcare by up to $880 billion in order to fund trillions of dollars in tax cuts whose benefits will largely flow toward the top 1%. It is as egregious a misplacement of our national priorities as I could imagine. And we're witnessing an unprecedented decimation of the federal workforce. And I worry that we could see an unprecedented evisceration of the social safety net upon which tens of millions of Americans depend. There are about 100 million Americans who depend on Medicaid, who benefit from Medicaid directly or indirectly.
It's the shame of it all is that I am someone who's predisposed to look favorably on the idea of, we need more government efficiency, a Department of Government Efficiency. In theory, yeah, that sounds great. I'm on board. Let's make the government leaner and meaner, and let's get better at doing the things we need to do. Because I don't think anybody would claim that the government is the most efficient thing in the world, but the way that they're going about it, with just a sledgehammer, breaking various parts of the government is really discouraging. And like you said, and now that that's done, it seems to be time to just gut programs that frankly lots of people rely on that you would think would be sacrosanct, but apparently are not.
It's evident to me that the mission of DOGE is not to make the government better and more effective. The mission of DOGE is to decimate the federal workforce, is to cripple the federal government's ability to govern. It's the starve the beast strategy taken to an unprecedented extreme. And I worry that the damage that Donald Trump and Elon Musk are doing to the governing capabilities of the federal government will endure long after their time in public office. Government institutions, like any institutions, are not switches that you can turn on and off. Like, these are institutions that are built over time. Their institutional memory is built over time. And when you dismantle them, the damage could be long-term and irreparable.
And again, the shame of it is that this wouldn't even address the budget problems that supposedly that we need to fix. I'm also someone who is, somewhat predisposed to take concerns about the deficit seriously. We do have a deficit. Long-term debt is on a worrying trajectory. And I think we should have some sort of serious attempt to control it in some way. But, $5 trillion in tax cuts is not a serious method of doing that. And like I said, I don't know, at some point you just get cynical about it. But one question I have for you as kind of someone in the middle of it, someone who's voting on this stuff and who cares deeply about this, I know when I talk to members of Congress and people who work in their offices, they would virtually always rather be talking about programs like this, about Medicaid, about SNAP, about the Department of Education, than talking about whatever's going on with some dumb culture war battle. But they always get sucked into talking about the culture war stuff rather than this. First, I guess I appreciate you being here to just, for us to talk about this, to spend the time actually talking about programs that affect 100 million Americans. But how do we get the public's attention on this? How do we spend more time communicating like, this is the thing that matters? Like, this is what's going to impact people's lives. And why is the media not screaming from the rooftops about this?
Well, Medicaid matters to the public, and the burden falls on us to give it the attention that it deserves. I was on Morning Joe, and I was asked about Donald Trump's executive order, attacking DEI. And I said, obviously, I disagree with his executive orders, but I'll be honest with you, I represent a district that is overwhelmingly Latino and African American. And I've never had a constituent approach me and tell me, Congressman, my highest priority is diversity, equity, and inclusion. Like, my constituents typically tell me my highest priority is housing, healthcare, public safety, the cost of living. And so I've long been of the view that we should ignore the fashionable nonsense, the culture wars, the three-letter acronyms, CRT and DEI and ESG, and focus on the issues that matter to people, the bread and butter issues of healthcare and housing and the cost of living and public safety. I've been advocating for a return to the basics because that's what resonates with voters and with people.
Now, one of the conversations that's happening at the same time we talk about the budget resolution, we mentioned DOGE, and there are people who are concerned about the idea of waste, fraud, and abuse. And that seems to be the three-word magic phrase that they're using to kind of justify cuts in hundreds of different programs. Whatever they want to cut is simply waste, fraud, and abuse. And I don't think that DOGE is doing that in any sort of good faith. But if there are people out there who say, well, we should care about that stuff, can't we make Medicaid a little bit better? Can't we, isn't there some areas of fraud or waste that we could attack? How would you respond to that, to people who, are not working for DOGE, but who've heard that and are like, well, yeah, we should deal with that? Are there areas of waste that we can cut? Are there smart things we can do? Or is this whole effort just entirely misguided, needs to be shut down at the core?
Well, first, I think we as Democrats should acknowledge that there is a problem. Like, if the Republicans are the party of less government, we should not be the party of more government. We should be the party of better, cheaper, and faster government. And we should acknowledge that there are inefficiencies. There are what the federal government calls improper payments. A few years ago, the Government Accountability Office found that there were about $186 billion worth of improper payments among 5 programs: Medicaid and Medicare, the Earned Income Tax Credit, Pandemic Unemployment Assistance, and PPP. And that's not a small number. That's a number that we have to take seriously. But the key to rooting out inefficiency is not to pluck a number like $880 billion out of thin air and then make draconian cuts to the program at the cost of diminishing access to healthcare. The solution lies in changing the incentives that govern our healthcare system. I feel like we do have to reach a point where we are rethinking the fee-for-service model that has historically governed the healthcare system. We should structure our healthcare system to reward not the quantity of health services, but the quality of healthcare. We should aim for what has been described as value-based procurement, but that's easier said than done.
Are there any particular countries or models that you would be looking at as like, that's what we should be aiming at? That particular country has a great way of doing it.
It's unclear to me because there are a number of countries that have single payer systems like Canada, or single payer and single provider systems like the British health system, but those systems have challenges as well. Like, it's a trade-off, right? So you might have you might get more health coverage, but you might get less in the way of quality. So, the American system feels so radically different from any other health system in the world, and certainly an industrialized world. And I feel like we have to aim, how do we restructure the incentives of the healthcare system to reward actual outcomes?
I think that makes sense. I mean, look, you talk to people in Canada or in England, and you ask them about the state of like the NHS in England. They're not very kind about it. They love the NHS, but the NHS has a lot of problems right now. I'd ask any British person. So your point is taken that, there's not going to be a system that magically solves every problem.
There's a tendency on the part of the American left, there's a tendency to present an idealized vision of single-payer healthcare that's quite different from the reality and from the lived experience of people who live in Britain and Canada. That's been my experience.
Returning to the point about waste, fraud, and abuse, like, look, the entire healthcare industry and system and the massively complex tangle of stuff that we've got going on, there's a lot of inefficiency, I would say, in our entire system. And it's not just government inefficiency. The private healthcare is notoriously inefficient in a lot of ways too. And so certainly there's ways we can make this better. And like, one of the numbers that I've seen is about 5% of Medicaid payment money is called improper payments, and that can mean different things. It can be overpayments, or it can be lack of documentation. But, I think we can work on that 5% while not, taking a hatchet to the program that would really gut coverage for the poorest people in society. I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time here.
Yes, and we have to, Medicaid has become 2 programs. It's become health insurance for the lowest income, and it's become long-term care for the elderly and the chronically ill and the disabled. And there's a competition for resources between those 2 programs. And in New York, we've seen exponential growth in long-term care, and it's been poorly managed. There's fundamental room for improvement. We have a program known as CDPAP, which enables, the elderly and the disabled to choose their own family members or their own friends as caregivers. And the growth in the program has been unsustainable. In the span of a decade, the program went from 12,000 consumers to 250,000. And the cost of the program has risen to $9 billion. And it has no licensing requirements, no oversight, no supervision. So reforming a program like CDPAP would have a real impact in reining in Medicaid costs in a state like New York. So there's certainly room for more efficient management, no question.
One other question I'd have, as we talk about all this, is the larger question of the federal budget. we do have a problem with, the national debt keeps growing, and the Republican Party, supposedly the party of traditionally has tried to label themselves the party of good governance and small government, and we're going to be the responsible fiscal managers. And that doesn't seem to be the case. Donald Trump is not really reducing spending, despite what Doge is doing. Federal spending is as high as ever, and they're proposing all these tax cuts. I guess in the context of all this, is this something we should be worried about? And how do we think about managing the federal budget without, again, taking a hatchet to programs that people rely on?
Well, I am principally concerned. I mean, we all should be concerned about the debt and deficit, right? Neither one should be taken lightly. But I am most concerned not so much about the size of our debt, but I'm concerned about the debt service. Like, we are paying a much higher interest rate than we've ever paid. The debt service exceeds about $1 trillion a year. And that's a function of high interest rates and inflation. And so that, to me, is the greater challenge than even the debt itself, because if we had large debt but a more manageable interest rate, then it's a problem that we could manage over time. But the interest that we're presently paying on the debt is unsustainable, and it's cannibalizing the federal budget.
And this is the worst time, like you pointed out, to be running up large deficits year over year. You can make an argument that, well, deficits are not that bad when interest rates are near zero. And, for the better part of a decade, post Great Recession, we did have interest rates at essentially zero. And so maybe it's not as much something to worry about. But now, like you said, inflation has risen, so the Federal Reserve has jacked up interest rates. And now when we take out, these massive budget deficits every year, now we're going to be hit with really, really large interest payments that are going to compound very, very quickly, it seems. And it's tough because we don't have a serious party in power.
Neither party is serious about fiscal responsibility. There is no fiscally responsible party in America, right? Both parties pretend to be fiscally responsible, but neither one, lives up to that challenge. There are people for whom, any spending cuts are unacceptable, and then there are people for whom any tax increases are unacceptable. And the reality is, putting the federal budget on a sustainable trajectory might require both. It's going to require greater government efficiency, and it's going to require both increased revenues and reasonable spending cuts.
We're coming up on time, so I want to ask the traditional final question that we often ask on this podcast, and that is, where can people go to learn more? If there are people who want to learn more about Medicaid itself, how the program runs and what it does, or about the budget resolution that Republicans have already introduced and will likely try to force into being a real budget later this year, what would you recommend for people who want to learn more or get more involved in this fight?
Despite the hyperpartisanship of Congress, Congress as an institution has wonderful resources. We have the Congressional Research Service, we have the Congressional Budget Office, and these are nonpartisan sources of information about programs like Medicaid. So those would be among the first sources that I would recommend that people consult.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for your time, and I want to specifically thank you, Congressman, for kind of taking charge and really leading the fight on specifically this. I wish we spent more time in public talking about programs like this that impact hundreds of millions of people. I wish more newspaper headlines were focused on this kind of thing. And maybe if we can be a small part of making that happen, then we're doing some good. Thank you one more time, everyone, to my guest for today, Congressman Ritchie Torres.